I made something for you.
Ooh.
So I make papyri facsimiles. Oh, my description is a little bit wonky here. You know, fix that. So you were talking about like what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52, John Rylands 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England.
So this is a copy of that exactly? This is exactly what it looks like?
Yeah, so I cut that out on the papyri with a scalpel, and then I transcribed the text on.
You did a great job, dude.
And
this is, you nerded out.
I know. I'm
for real nerded out. This is a real nerding out of.
So that's actually, so that's someone else's facsimile, which is not as good as the one I made.
It's not as good. Yours is better.
And where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and Jesus says, everyone who follows the truth, who is following the truth, follows me. And on the back has the words of Pilate saying, what is truth? But so part of my research, so the reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. And so he had this, he was a student of Hegel. Have you ever heard of Hegelian dialectic? So you have like a thesis, synthesis, and antithesis.
Yes.
So Hegel had this philosophical theory, and his student Bauer takes that and he incorporates this into history. And he says, you know, the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus, and then the later gospels have a very like the last of what are called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has a very kind of more divine Jesus. And so he says, based on this, John is the last written one. And it combines these two where you get a very human and a very divine Jesus together. And so based on this, he says that John has to be 2nd century. Well, we discover this guy. C.H. Roberts is, you know, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being like stashed away. And he finds this guy and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript. Wow. Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably, and potentially even like most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
Wow.
And it's because of that guy. And because of my academic work where I was telling you, like in paratextual features, when we look at these tiny manuscripts and you figure out, okay, well, what does that look like on the page? I also made you. So this is, I used 2 different variations of papyri.
Whoa.
So you have there where P52 would have been on the page, and based on it's called codicological conventions, the spacings of the words, and the way that the size of the margin that we can see, where it would have been on the page and how big the page would have actually been. So this is like a reconstruction, and then I filled in the rest of the text in the same sort of stylistic hand of the scribes at that time, what that page would have looked like. So this would have come from what would have been essentially a pocket copy of the Gospel of John.
Wow. That's unbelievable. Wow. That's so fascinating.
So this is the kind of work that I do in terms of trying to figure out, okay, you have these fragments. How big would have this codex actually been? How big would have the document been? And then you compare and you contrast them to, say, like non-Christian literature, like Thucydides or Tacitus or Pliny or Cicero or Cassiodeo, those kind of guys, and look at the differences between how these documents would have been put together and written in their day.
God, it's so beautiful. It's just so bizarre to imagine these people writing this stuff down so long ago.